Doing well. I hope that you are doing well. God bless you. We're going to talk a little bit about the kings and queens of ancient Kush today. So I hope that you are doing well. God bless you. We're going to get started here and talk a little bit about the kings and queens of ancient Kush. So I hope that you are doing well. I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about these wonderful men and women, these people who helped to kind of revitalize the ancient kingdom of Kush a long time ago. And as we think about Kush, the ancient kingdom of Kush is not something that just started 1,000 years ago or 2 or even 3,000 years ago. This is an area of the world, an area of Africa that extends back hundreds of thousands of years. Even if you go back into millions of years, because human ancestral remains are there, right there in that northeast part of Africa. So that whole area has a long history, right? So I want to talk about it, and I want to remember their names. I think as we think about people from ancient Kush, as we think about our ancestors and all the things they brought to life, there's so many things about Kush that we just skip over. There's so many things about Kush that we just don't talk about, and people do that in the modern world. But it's up for us to retake and reclaim, if you will. Maxine Waters says, reclaiming our time. It's time for us to reclaim our history, reclaim our ancestry, to really look back at people for what they really brought to us. So I want to ask you to kind of remove all those things from your mind. Let's remove these things from our mind in terms of what people say. Let's begin to fill ourselves with actual information about ancient Kush, and let's look at what our ancestors have to say. Let's look at them for what they were able to bring to the world and what they were able to bring to their society. Because let's face it, they had a society in an area that lasted for thousands of years. And you can look back of many parts of human history and see people in this area thriving and having their families stay together, having their families be healthy and to thrive together and to stick together. So they're able to accomplish some things that we are still trying to remake and do today, so we have yet to accomplish today. So I want to spend the time and talk a little about ancient Kush as we kind of jump into that whole era and just talk about them, because as we dig in out, I do want to say that the resource that I'm going to go over today, so what we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about a timeline. I'm going to be giving a snapshot of this to the people who are members on my channel, so I very much appreciate it. I also have another booklet coming to you soon with respect to that talks about Khonsu and his family and the people who helped to create the wonderful tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. So I talked with them last week. I'm going to have a booklet for those who are members, and membership is just $4.99 a month. I very much appreciate and thank you for those who supporting. So you're going to get also a snapshot of this timeline, which I'll be giving to members very soon. As soon as I make some edits to it, you'll be getting that as well. Those who are members who pay for $4.99 a month. So I very much appreciate it. So thank you and God bless you. So let's jump into this. Let's talk about ancient Kush as we kind of get into this. And as we look at it, I want to make a couple of things as we look at it, because as we think about this, you got to think about ancient Kush, and you got to think about it not just in terms of Kemet or just in terms of the quote unquote 25th dynasty, right? So we're going to be talking about members of people called the 25th dynasty, but they were a dynasty in and of themselves. They aren't just to be talked about in terms of their relationship to Kemet, right? So we're going to talk about them, but their lives and their story and their history begins way before that. So when we start to talk about the 25th dynasty, we're going to get into 900 BC, 800 BC. We're going to be talking about things with respect to that. But their history goes back way further than it goes back way further than that. So we got to kind of have that appreciation. And as I kind of take myself out of the picture here, just so you can get a good view of this the map right here, just so you can get an idea of what we're looking at right here. So when you look at ancient Kush, you're talking about, even when you look at ancient Kush, even when you look at Kush from 3,500 BC, so 3,500 years before Christ, and obviously, as I mentioned, before we even say that, human beings come from Africa and human ancestors come from Africa. And so when you look at human remains, and you're going to go back hundreds of thousands of years, especially in this area, and you're going to go back millions of years for human ancestors in Africa, across Africa, right? In Central Africa, Northern Africa, South, you're going to go back millions of years in terms of human ancestral activity in Africa. But as we look at even Homo sapiens like you and I, you're going back hundreds of thousands of years. And when you look at it, just with respect to that, this area right here, which is Sai Island, I want to point that out because that's right around, is between the second and the third cataract in what is today modern day Sudan. That island, which is right in the middle of the Nile. So the Nile is a huge river, as you know, and there are several islands up and down the Nile, up and down the Nile Valley that are there. And they're remarkable places. Some of them are places of worship. Some of them places are temple. When you look at Sai Island right here, right in this area of the Nile in what is today modern Sudan, that island has ancestral remains that go back like 200,000 years. You got some 200,000 years of human ancestral and human Homo sapien artifacts and activity on Sai Island. So right around there. So when you start to stop and think about it, you got to just put out of your mind when people say there's no activity there, or they act as if, Africans were not doing something, or somehow these people who existed in Africa, and specifically up and down the Nile Valley, somehow they existed there for thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, and somehow they were not there in Northeast Africa as Kemet developed. So, people say things like that, but I want you just to put in your mind and understand that when you talk about the Sudan, and you talk about specifically the area that is the Sudan, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years of human ancestral activity, if you will. And Sai Island is a place that you can look up. So I ask you to look it up. God bless you. Extra money. God bless you. Just give flowers. I appreciate that. Flowers are important. Give flowers while people are alive, right? That's very much important. So God bless you for the flowers, for the emojis there. I appreciate it. So when you think about Sai Island, when you think about ancient Kush, understand, and Sai Island is a place that you can look up. So it's one of these UNESCO, designated places because they have such, a long history of human activity, 200,000 years. So I encourage you to look it up. Don't just take my word for it. Look it up. United Nations has a whole write-up on Sai Island, and you can find a lot of information that's out there that'll tell you about activity on Sai Island. But we do know people, human beings like you and I, have been on Sai Island and have had interactions and activity in this area for at least 200,000 years. So a long period of time. So as we start to think about it, you understand that the people that are Kush, that are ancient Kush, they're around for a while. There's a long history of people in and out of this area, and people ebb and flow. Just like anything, you think about life is kind of like a roller coaster. Things are going to be up, you're going to be up, and there are times you're going to be down. You're going to be awake, and there are times you're going to be asleep. There's going to be ups and downs in your life. You're going to live, you're going to die. Those things happen to anybody, to any nation, any area, any people. It happens to anybody. So as you think about that, you really have to, have that same concept in your mind when we study ancient Kush. So we can go back, as far as I mentioned, a couple 100,000 years here. But as we kind of speed up the time and talk more about the time of ancient Kush and Kemet, you start to look at a time at around 3,500 years before Christ. And you will find, things with respect to Kustal, and you will find A group Nubians all up in here in Kubania and in the area of what will become ancient Kemet. People are there. And you find people who are Nubian are in this area 3,200 years before Christ. They're there before Kemet becomes a country. You find Napatan. All that's taking place up and down this valley in what is considered Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia. So as we kind of look at our map here, this area right here between the third and the fifth and sixth cataract, this is considered Upper Nubia, higher grounds. This is the area between the second and the first cataract right here, which is modern day Egypt now. That was considered Lower Nubia. Then you get into here and you get into Upper Kemet, which is the southern part, and then you get into Lower Kemet, when you get into like Hecapata and Memphis and to the Delta. So those are the areas where lower, upper. That's the areas that we're talking with respect to Kush and Kemet at that time. And so you can go back, 3,500 years before Christ, and you can find activity right here around this third cataract of the Nile. You find activity right here around Kerma, the city of Kerma, which I'm sure you know about. And there's a lot of documentation with respect to Kerma and its temples and its people. And you can read a lot of things by Charles Bonnet and some of the archaeological evidence that's been done there. So you find that in that whole time with respect to Kerma, there's a period of 1,000 years, from about 3,500 years before Christ to about 2,500 years before Christ, where people are thriving. People in that area of what will become Kush, what would be called Kush. Now, at times, this might have been called Yam. It may have had different names. And you have a lot of different people. It's not just one group of people. There are a lot of people in this area. There are a lot of societies, people who form small family groups and societies are up and down the Nile. So it's not like it's just one or two people or one or two groups of people, but people like to lump together. But these are different people who are here. And so you will find that from 3,500 to 2,500 BC, there's a thriving area in this whole area that is Kerma. And you find that there's trade going on. There's gold all up and down here. There's literally a traffic, a highway, a modern day highway, if you will, that's going up and down this area, feeding gold and incense and ebony and ivory and various things from the further south in Africa up through the Nile Valley into Kush and into what will become ancient Kemet, and then out to the Mediterranean, across the Red Sea, over into various places in the islands and in that whole area that is that area. And a lot of that's coming through Kush, and Kush is facilitating that. And so when you think about it, as we're going to start to talk about some of the people within the Napatan dynasty, I want us to have that as our mindset and our background that 900 BC is just an area of time where there was a resurgence of Kush. It wasn't as if that this was the first time there was a Kush. And so we know that from about 3500 to 2500, there was Kush, and there was this whole area that is Yam, that's developing, that is thriving in this area. And then you have a period of time where eventually it's going to be a middle Kerma and things like that will happen. And eventually you'll have the new kingdom come in from about 1500 BT to about 1070 BC. And the people of ancient Kemet come down because they have some strong problems going on in ancient Kemet, and they eventually take over part of Kush. They take over the lower part and they take over the upper part here. So they take it over. And then around 1070 BC, things kind of fall apart in ancient Kemet, and the new kingdom kind of crumbles, and you have this vacuum there. So you have the new kingdom crumbles. And what you find is that the people of ancient Kush begin to reorganize. They had been dominated for about 430 years, or a little more than 400 years, by the ancient Kemetic people. Well, now, around 900 BC, once the new kingdom has left, they start to reorganize, and you start to see something else take place in Kush. One of the things that I think is remarkable, because how hard is it, how difficult is it for you to take a situation where you have been dominated by somebody, where you have been, maybe kind of taken over by somebody, even though they meshed well in terms of culture, they were still being dominated, they were still controlled. How difficult is it for you to be dominated by somebody, for you to take whatever impact was happening in your area and in your land and to reorganize yourself? I mean, I think about Africans all over the world, and I think about African Americans, how difficult it is to be in a situation where you're being oppressed. And you are dealing with all the different factors that are impacting your nation and in your area and in your communities, and you want to resurge yourself. You want to bring forth life. And as they did this, as they reorganized ancient Kush, they did this in a way that was remarkable. And so I want to remember these people's names. I want to kind of jump out and talk about their names. So what you find is right here around 900 BC, you start to find that Upper Nubia, this whole part that's in the southern part of Nubia, what is today modern day Sudan, that Upper Nubia begins to rebuild itself. It begins to kind of coalesce. They take all these different areas, all these areas that are right here in the southern part of what will become Kush, this Upper Nubia here. They begin to take these areas and to begin to bring them into one. So you find, as I mentioned to you, it's not like it's just one people, or it's not like you didn't have situations where people were disparate and disunified and kind of cut apart from each other. They begin to have to form a coalition and decide to want to be together as a family, decide to want to be together as a country, decide to take all of their history and to bring themselves back together and to resurge. We talk a lot about the new kingdom, and we should talk about the new kingdom. We talk a lot about the story of Asar and Auset, and how Auset was able to bring Asar's body back together and to revive him. We got to talk about these folks here, because they were after a period of more than 400 years, some 400 years of being dominated by the new kingdom and fighting that whole time, like fighting back for that entire time, just about now to be able to reorganize themselves into one great country, one great society that will last for over another 1,000 years. So what happens is around 900 BC, as we take a look at it, God bless you. Hope that you are doing well. What happens is around 900 BC, you find them begin to organize. And I want to kind of call their names, because one of the names that kind of jumps out, and this kind of family tree kind of shouts at you. This is actually Taharka here, and you can see some of the pyramids of Meru. But let's kind of jump out and look at a little bit at this family tree here. And as we look at this, and I'll kind of make it bigger so you can see it even a little better than that. So one of the people that stands out, who begins to kind of reunite that all of the southern part of Nubia, all of Upper Nubia, is Alar. And his name, he is somebody who kind of stands out because he begins to take that part of what is Sudan and Upper Nubia and unite the people and to bring them under one country, under one society, under one king, right? And there were probably people before him. So as we start to think about the Napatan dynasty, we know that there were people before him who came into power, but he's the one who his name kind of stands out in history, if you will. And why is it called Napata? We should address that really quick too. Why is it even called Napata as we look at this? So as I point this out, I want to let you know there were centers of power, and in the first part of Kemet, in the early part of Kemet, from about 3500 to 2500, and then from about 2500 to 1500, you find this area of Kerma being a center of power. But as you start to get to this new period, this resurgence, if you will, at around 900 BC, you find that the center of power becomes Napata, and that's right around the fourth cataract of the Nile. And that's why they call it the Napatan dynasties, because their capital and their center of power was right there in Napata. You find them having burial grounds there in El Kuru and Nuri, and as well as the famous sacred mountain right here of Jebel Barka, the Pure Mountain, is right here, all near Napata. That becomes the area. And then after about 600 years or so, 600 or 700 years or so, the capital changes to Merowe. And so you will find them called, and we don't know why the capital changes. Some people will say it's because of a war, but that took place so far after between each other that probably was not the case. They changed their capital. They always had Merowe as a part of their kingdom. It was always a part of the Kush's kingdom, but they end up changing their capital and their burial ground to Merowe around 300 BC, after about 600 years after the Napatan dynasty. So you will see it referred to as the Napatan dynasty, and you will see the Meroitic dynasty. You'll see people refer to Merowe. So there's two periods of this resurgence of New Kush, if you will. I'll call it New Kush, of this resurgence of New Kush. One centered in Napata, around the Fourth Cataract, and then one centered at Merowe, farther south along the Nile is where you'll find it. So this first group that kind of comes into part is the Napatan group. And they're called, as I mentioned, the Napatan dynasty. And you begin to see them really talk a lot about Alara here. And Alara, just to call his name, let's call his name and talk about him. He becomes a remarkable person who helps to unify that part of Sudan and Upper Kush. And his brother is Kashta. His brother here is Kashta, and he also begins to take over after his brother. Now, Kashta becomes, I think, a significant person, because Kashta not only takes the southern part, if you will, of Nubia, the upper Nubia, he begins to take the influence north. He begins to take the influence, because Kush in this area that was Kerma, they had always had ebb and flows in terms of their power centers in the northern to them. They've always had, people in the lower Nubia that they were interacting with, and at times they were controlling. So it wasn't anything new to them to push their power farther up and push their power right on the borders of what would be Kemet. And at this point in time, the new kingdom had fallen, right? And the new kingdom was in kind of disarray, but there's still a very powerful priest in Auset, in the southern part of ancient Kemet, which we call Thebes today, or the Temple of Karnak, right? There were still famous people there. Kashta takes his power and his ability to bring people together, and he takes that unification ability, and he brings it all the way into upper Nubia, lower Nubia, and takes it right into the southern part of Kemet. So when you start to see ancient Kemet, you're starting to see Kashta really shake hands with the people who were there in Auset. He takes over the lower part of Nubia. He already had control of the upper part of Nubia. His brother did that. He takes over lower Nubia, and he goes right into Kemet, in the southern part of Kemet. And apparently there isn't like a battle. There isn't like a fight. They aren't looking at the Kushite people as being evil or foreign. They see them as practicing the same religion. They actually see them as practicing and kind of holding up the worship of our men the way it's supposed to be held up. These are the priests. These are Kemetic priests in ancient Kemet, right? Who are looking at and welcoming Kushite kings who have taken over all of Kush and all of Lower Nubia into the southern part of Kemet, into the most famous temple in ancient Kemet, which is Ipet Isut, Temple of Karnak. They are welcoming Kushite kings. And I bet you a lot of people who say that Kush was, this way, or referred to them as the wretched Kush, they're looking at and they're quoting, some New Kingdom monument that was written and built during a time, and the documentation was written during a time when they were fighting with Kush. They quote that. They never really quote you when the Kemetic people said the same thing about people who were in Asiatic places. They don't talk about that about people in the East or other places. They only mention when they talk about Kush, but they also don't tell you, I bet they don't say that here were actual Kemetic people welcoming Kushite people right around the time of King Kashta and of King Piankhy, who we'll talk about in just a minute, in this 8th century BC, welcoming them, seeing them as brothers, and welcome their kingship. See, nobody ever talks about that. When you hear people tell you that the Kemetic people hated the Kushite people, don't just believe it. Don't just put that willy-nilly. Don't just accept that without doing your own research. Read it. Read King Piankhy's victory stela. I have it in my book, Read Religion of the Black Land, and you can find it. You can research it and find it yourself. You can read his victory stela. Look at the documentation for how he came into Kemet, especially the southern part of Kemet, and he was welcomed. He was asked to come. They were welcome. And I want to kind of push this point, because the Kemetic people were not seeing them as foreigners or as evil or as anti them. They were seeing them as basically kind of saviors, because things were falling apart, and they welcomed them. And they saw them as practicing their religion. So when Kashta comes in and when King Piankhy comes in after him, they are performing ceremonies and rites and rituals at the Temple of Karnak that only kings perform. They are putting their family members, like Amanidiris, which we'll talk about in Shepenwepet II, into the high priestess, the highest level you could be at in terms of authority in Ipet Asut, in the largest temple in Kemet, one of the largest temples in the world. They are putting their families there, and they are taking over, and they are performing those rites, and they are being welcomed. So it's a very, so don't just let people tell you that there was this hate relationship. Look at the entire of this. And when you look at this is what people call the 25th dynasty of ancient Kemet. But as you can see, they were around and doing things in Kush before they went into Kemet. They were uniting Kush and doing things in Upper Nubia and Lower Nubia before they went into Kemet. Don't just let people tell you that there was this love, this hate relationship, and there was nothing else there. They were being brought in and being asked to come and welcomed by Kemetic priests who were actual Kemetic people. Because people like to look at, they'll argue about, heredity and things, but these were Kemetic people welcoming Kushite kings in. And so Kashta, his brother Alari kind of helps to kick off things, even though there were people before them. Kashta begins to take things into Lower Nubia and into ancient Kemet and is welcomed, if you will. And then King Piankhy, who is Kashta's son. So King Piankhy, so just so we can take, and we've talked a lot about a couple of things, a number of times about King Piankhy here, but I want to kind of mention him again and mention some of his family members, his brothers and sisters, and mention him again, just kind of show you this tree. King Piankhy is a son of Kashta. King Piankhy is the famous man who came into Kemet at this time. As I mentioned, the people in Napata, the kings of Kush, were already in control. They were already in control of the southern part of Kemet. They were already in control of the Petsut, Auset, and Ashwan, and what you would call Yebu, and all that area they were in control of, and the first and second cataract, and all the way down to the sixth cataract. They were already in control of all that. They came into Kemet, and King Piankhy kind of led that charge. And he talks about a famous, wonderful stela, which I just told you about, which I mentioned, that he talks about how the people were asking him, the people from the southern part of Kemet were asking him, hey, there's some things going on in Kemet. And in our area and in our country, there's some things happening. And we look at like the northern and southern part of our areas, in this area right here, ancient Kemet was this is Thebes or Auset, if you will. This part was, like I said, under the control of King Piankhy and the Kushite kings. And at the time Piankhy rose to power, there were people in the northern part of Kemet who were really trying to take over. They were trying to come to the southern part of Kemet and take this over, even though the Kushite people were in charge. And the folks that were in Auset, and what is today Thebes, we call Thebes, didn't want that. They didn't like that. And they continued to see the Kemetic, the Kushite kings as being the true rulers, continued to see them as worshiping men in the appropriate way. And so they asked King Piankhy, they saw Kashta as somebody who they respected, and they asked King Piankhy, look, this is your land. We see that things are happening. We see you're there basically in Napata. Come to Kemet, because there are people in the north who are trying to come, and they're marching. They're marching on towns in the north, and they're taking over, and they're challenging your authority. This is Kemetic people in the southern part of Kemet, most likely Kemetic priest, writing to King Piankhy right here, King Piankhy, the son of Kashta, writing to him in Napata and saying, they're coming to take over your land. Guys, when people tell you that ancient Kemet hated the Kushite people, it's just not true. And a lot of times when they tell you about King Piankhy and they tell you about this Napatan dynasty, they don't tell you this part. They don't tell you it, even though they have the documentation. Literally, it's more than 3,000 years. It's like thousands of years old. They have the documentation. People, they leave that out. They don't really tell you that they were welcoming them and looking at them to shake their hands. So this idea that there was this disconnection forever between ancient Kush and ancient Kemet is not true. It's kind of, debunked. It's kind of just, forget that, just kind of bop, if you will. And so Piankhy is the king who comes in, and he, as I said, he was already in control of Auset. He was already in control of the southern part of Kemet. He didn't have to take that over. They were already paying tribute to him, and they welcomed him. And when he came as a part of his victory stela and his victory march, if you will, because he would eventually take over Lower Kemet too, they had him do ceremonies and rites that only kings do. When you read Kemetic literature, you find that there's certain days and carrying of the statues that were representing on men that only certain people did. Only the king could do certain things in terms of going into the holiest holies of place, or taking the bark at a certain point in time, or doing certain processions. And King Piankhy came and did those things, performed those rites at Ipepesut, at Karnak, as a part of his kickoff for when he was going to go farther north and fight the people who were trying to come farther south. Because at the time, the other thing to mention, these kings of Napata, these Kushite kings, they didn't really care too much about other people. They were not really impressed. They were controlling their area, controlling their trade, worshiping their God, handling their business. They didn't have to be, impressed by other people. They didn't have to impress other people or pay attention to other people. There are famous times like Queen Arenas later on where they were asking her questions about who was Caesar. Like who is Caesar? Who is Caesar? There are a lot of people in ancient Kush. They do not appear to be afraid of or even thinking about other people. They appear to be running their business and running it very well. They don't appear to be impressed with it. So as he's handling at this point in time, King Piankhy is handling his business in Kush, right there out of Napatan, out of his capital. And he has all kinds of people that are with him that are part of his kingdom. Southern Kemet, they have relations with people to the south of them, to the east of them, probably the land of Punt, people like that. They're handling their business and they're not really worried about it. But as the people in the north start to try to come farther south to take over more of his land, he says, okay, we're not going to have that. And so he comes and he performs rites during the New Year ceremony at Ipet at Karnak, rites that only a king will do. And he begins to have a march where he marches north. And it's a famous stela that every time I talk about it, it really inspires me because it talks about conquest and war with mercy. With wisdom, with morality. He talks about doing things and fighting people and sieging things and doing things with morality, as well as fighting when he needs to. All kinds of things that really shows you something about the Kushite value system and what they thought was important. So this whole idea of Ma'at, the people from Kush, this dynasty, these people here were living it. These people were serious about this whole idea of being godlike, of respecting your elders, of women being important. Even Piankhy took his wives with him on his war. And one of the major battles where there was a negotiation to take place, the negotiation first took place amongst the women. The women from the king who was going to submit and Piankhy's wife and daughters met. The women came to the women first. The women who were going to submit, that were losing, came to Piankhy's family, his females in his family, to talk to them before the king came to talk to Piankhy. Maybe they were afraid to come to Piankhy, but they came to the women first. This whole idea about there being queens and significant people in ancient Kush is significant. So King Piankhy is the person who helps to take over and solidify. And so people will tell you, just so you have like a time frame in your mind, people will tell you, well, this is the 25th dynasty and they started with King Piankhy. Well, don't take that time frame as just being literal. Don't just take that, because as you know and as you see here, they are doing things in their own right before King Piankhy. He's not the first person. And the 25th dynasty is what you called, they were their own dynasty. They were revitalizing their own land in their own way. So don't just limit it to Piankhy. Know that Piankhy had a father, Kashta, and Kashta had a brother, and they had fathers and they had mothers. And these were all people, even 100 years, well over 100 years before Piankhy was even born, they were organizing in ancient Kush. So let's not limit what they do. Let's, take that lid off of it, right? Let's take the lid that they try to put on and say these were people who were doing things, and what they did in Kush was important. It was important in and of itself before they even got to Kemet. And after they left Kemet, they were still important, right? So as we think about this, so after, Piankhy is, as I mentioned, one of the more famous rulers of this Napatan dynasty, and he's ruling in the 8th century BC. His brother is Shabaka. And as we talk about Shabaka, just so you can see this, and I mentioned those who are members, I'm going to give you a snapshot of this timeline so that you can see it. God bless you. Hope all is doing well. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you a shot out of this for those who are members. His brother, Piankhy's brother, is Shabaka. This is the famous Shabaka of the Shabaka stone. So when you think about the Memphite theology, if you ever heard about that, the idea of Ptah and there being one God that brought all things into existence by deciding in his heart and speaking with his tongue and making those things come into existence. This is Shabaka. That's Shabaka. That's King Piankhy's brother, Kashta's son. That's the whole part of this Napatan dynasty. He becomes a famous person in the Napatan dynasty. And not only that, you have Amenarderis the first. This is Piankhy's sister, Kashta's daughter. She becomes God's wife of men. It is the most powerful and highest position, probably at this time, maybe even higher than the high priest, either at the same level or maybe just below, but maybe even higher than the high priest when you read the documents at this time at Ipet, the largest temple in the world, the temple of Karnak. At this time, when Piankhy comes in and Kashta comes in, his sister, Amenarderis, Kashta's daughter, becomes the God's wife of men. She becomes the high priestess who is responsible for interceding between God, amen, and the king. So she has a significant, and she has a whole bunch of resources, material resources that are at her disposal, that are being sent to her from all over the kingdom, from all over temples that are being sent to God's wife of men. That's Piankhy's sister. That's a part of this whole Napatan dynasty. So when people start to say that they are not a part of Kemet, they very rarely mention to you their high priestesses that they had at the temple of Karnak, and what they were in charge of, and how they were welcomed, and how they were seen as being one and not something that was different. And so Amenadiris is also there. The first is King Piankhy's sister. So this is all part of Costa's children. And you start to think, wow, this was a heck of a family, right? But it doesn't stop there as we start to call their names. After Shabaka, there's Shabiku or Shabika, how you like to say it. He becomes king for a period of time, and he is someone who is continuing to move forward. So you have to know that around this period of time, around 698 BC, and the Assyrian army is in power. The Assyrian army is fighting in what is today modern day Iraq, Syria, that whole area up and down there around the Tigris and the Euphrates. They're taking over a lot of places. It is during this time and just before this time that Taharka becomes a part of the royal family, and he begins to go to places like Jerusalem, apparently to help out Jerusalem. He's mentioned in the Bible. It's around this time, mostly during Shapiku or during Shabaka's reign, that Taharka is a part of the family. He leaves from the southern part of this kingdom in what is today like Merowe or right around Napatan, and he goes into Kemet to head the army and to lead the army into what is today Gaza, really the Palestinian area, going towards Jerusalem to help fight the Assyrian army. And he's mentioned in the Bible. All of this is taking place right around this time. So Shabika becomes a significant person as he takes over, and his wife is Kahalta. So one of the queens, whose queens names I want to mention, the Queen Kahalta, she's also a significant woman. As we think about her and her family and her son who becomes king, this is the tomb, her son's tomb here, and we'll see a lot more about her and what she was able to bring forth. But the women in ancient Kush were significant. The queen mothers played an important role in terms of heredity and who would become king next. They weren't just in terms of the babies that they would have. They were actually had significant roles that they played in who would be assigned the kingship. They also, as time went on, they also played a part in a role as in terms of generals in the army. They also led the kingdom, led the army, led it as generals. They were women who fought, women who gave birth, women who were queens in their own right. They were not women who were just off to the side, kind of, just trophies or displayed. That was not the case. The queens of Kush stand in a very significant, special place in human history because they achieve things thousands of years ago that some women in areas today have yet to achieve. And they stand out even in terms of warfare, in terms of being generals, in terms of negotiations, in terms of politics, in terms of running a kingdom side by side with their sons themselves or by themselves or the husbands. They did that. And Queen Kahalta, somebody, as we start to think about, represents that as we start to think about just the whole area. So she becomes a significant part. And Taharka is like the sixth in this line, if you will. As I look from Alar being the first, Taharka becomes a significant person. Taharka is king for a long period of time. He is king around this time. He becomes king for a long period of time. As I mentioned, he's mentioned in the Bible. He fights the Assyrian army several times, and sometimes he won, sometimes he lost, sometimes he at least was in a tie with them, sometimes he lost, but he was somebody who fought them several times and lived to tell about it. They never killed him. He did get attacked very badly, but there were times when he fought them off, and he was king for almost 30 years. So about 26 years he was king. He was somebody who did so many building projects. The buildings that took place in ancient Kemet were not just taking place, at this time in the Kemet area. You find that they were building places and building tombs and monuments and temples and keeping things up. And this is one of the temples of Jebel Barka that Taharka helped to build temples at this area. They were building things. He was building things all up and down Kemet as well as in Kush. So when he dies, he leaves a significant impact on the whole history of Kush because of the temples he left, the longevity of his reign, and I think because of his seed. So there are many things that he's accomplished for that I'll kind of mention, but as I mentioned here, he's coming around in this 7th century BC, and Taharka's kind of taken over, and you end up finding that there are challenges. Things are happening all over the world. There are things happening all over the world this time where, as I mentioned, the Assyrian army is kind of taking over and killing people in a brutal way, and the Kushite people are fighting the Assyrians on several fronts. So not only does Taharka fight him, and I've talked about that as well, but also eventually Tanwetamani fights him, and he is the son of Queen Kahalta and of Shabaka. So he begins to fight him as well. So you end up finding that Tanwetamani fights them. And so the Kushite people are having these interactions with some of the most powerful armies in the world, and they're still maintaining their own land. They're still maintaining their own land. So even though Tanwetamani, he gains some parts of ancient Kush, which I'll talk about, do a whole story on him as well, a whole lesson on him. But he regains some area, and then he has to retreat. And as he retreats back to Kush, a lot of times people end their story there. Their story doesn't end, because the whole idea and the whole family that is Kush in the society lasts for another 1,000 years after they leave Kemet. They keep up the traditions. Even when the Greeks are coming and the Romans are coming, they're keeping up the traditions of the old ways in ancient Kush. They're believing in this whole idea, this concept of truth and ma'at and amen, and they're being balanced between male and female. Their whole idea, they are talking about this, and they are keeping it up for another 1,000 years. And one of the things that's significant, that I thought was significant as I was reading about this and researching it, as you think about King Taharka, there is believed that not only did he have one of his sisters as well as his daughter become or about to become the God's wife of men, but his seed, Atlantsur, right here, Atlantsur, if you will, Atlantsur, right? I'll get this right. Atlantsur, thank you. This gentleman becomes the king after Tanwetamani, and he is Atlantsur becomes the next king. It's believed that he is Taharka's son. So there's some discussion about whether or not he is Tanwetamani's son or if he's Taharka's son, but most likely, in all likelihood, he is the son of King Taharka. If you understand it and think about it, that would mean that the line of Kushite kings, because when you look at them, and we're going to talk about the rest of them later on, the line of Kushite kings lives on through Taharka, which would be one of the reasons why you find him so well respected throughout Kushite history, because his seed passes on, and it kind of stops with his brothers in terms of who becomes king, but his seed kind of passes on, because you will find that a lot of these early kings, just so you know, and you have your own kind of notes and do your own research, a lot of these early kings, such as Alara and Kashta and Piankhy right here, you will find that they were buried in a place called El Kuru. So if you look at El Kuru, that's right there around Napatan, around the fourth cataract of the Nile, they were buried in El Kuru. But Taharka was buried in Nuri. He moved the family burial ground to a different area, and he was buried, and he was the first person buried. Then he has like a very large pyramid, if you will, that's there, a pyramid. They built and then died and built their graves in pyramids. There are more pyramids in the Sudan than there are in ancient Kemet. And I know people will make comments about that, but the reality is they were practicing this religion for over 1,000 years after the New Kingdom left. They were practicing this religion. So they have more pyramids in the Sudan, in this area that is Kush, more than there are in ancient Kemet. They were being more Kemet than the Kemet people. But that line, so Taharka moves his pyramid and his burial ground to a different cemetery. And one person kind of moves it back to El Kuru. And then after that, after Atlantsur, they begin to have almost all of the rest of the lines of the Napatan dynasty, if you will, are buried in the same area of Nuri, the cemetery that Taharka's tomb is in, his pyramid is in. So when I think about it, it makes you think of how important he was to their society and how important he was to their history, that his line, that through him, the seed lives on, the line lives on. So you find that this whole area, this whole Napatan dynasty lasts from about 900 BC to about 300 BC. So for about 600 years. And then there's a switch where it goes to Meroe. As I mentioned, they go farther south and the capital becomes Meroe, and they call it the Meroitic dynasty. And that will last for another 600 years. So you have like 1,200 years of history right here in this whole resurgence of Kush. This whole area that is Kush has about 1,200 years of history in and of itself. And this is long after the New Kingdom is gone. This is long after, long after a lot of the people who were famous in ancient Kemet are old and gone. The people in Napata and in Meroe are still practicing this religion, and there's some moving on. So I want to remember the names today. I'm going to come back and talk about more. I thank you so much for joining me. God bless you. And please tell somebody about it. Please share this with somebody. God bless you. Talk to you soon.